there is a risk of thinking that if it's not invented here, it's no good, or that everything important is invented only in the developed countries. The developed countries are still going to be important engines of innovation, but a lot of very good and useful innovations are going to come from strange places. E-payments, mobile payments was pioneered in Kenya. Who would have thought?
Hello, and welcome to our podcast, International Business Today, where we talk about current international business issues of great importance to you, our audience, to academics, to practitioners, and to students. Our guest today is Professor Ravi Ramamurti. He's a distinguished professor here at the university, Northeastern University, Demormakim College of Business. He is from India originally. He studied at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, has a doctorate from the Harvard Business School, has been a consultant for the World Bank, has been a visiting professor at MIT and in Switzerland at IMD. And we're very pleased to have someone who's so knowledgeable about emerging markets with us today. So Ravi,
Yep.
I'm delighted to have you here.
Same here.
And I want to start talking about something you've written about a great deal, reverse innovation. Can you tell us what it means and why it is something you've been so interested in and have written so much about?
Sure. First, let me explain what the concept is. If you think of the last 2 centuries, most of the innovations have gone from the developed countries to the developing countries. Reverse innovation is exactly the opposite. It's about innovations going from developing countries to the developed countries. This is somewhat counterintuitive because you can understand why a developing country would want to learn from the developed countries. But why would a developed country ever want to learn from a developing country? But actually, there's lots of reasons that they can benefit from this kind of learning. Let me give you just 2 examples. I think that might make the concept clearer. One, I'll give you an old example, and then I'll give you a more recent example. The old example is microfinance. If you think about where that originated, it started in Bangladesh as a response to the failure of traditional banks to lend to the poor, to lend particularly to women, to make small loans, to lend to people who couldn't provide collateral. So they invented a new kind of a bank. And this model, the microfinance model, became something that many other emerging economies then copied. And in fact, it also came to the U.S. Grameen, in fact, has an operation in the U.S. And the reason is that we have poor people in the U.S. as well. Just as we have rich people in the poor countries, we have poor people in the rich countries. So that's the reason why the Grameen Bank idea diffused from a developing country to a developed country. Now, fast forward to the present and take an example like TikTok, which started in China. In a social media innovation with a short video format, spread like wildfire in China within a very short period of time. And then an equally short period of time went overseas, first to some other developing countries like India, and then came to the US, where, as you know, there are more than 100 million users and addicts among the younger population. And we're still debating what to do, whether to allow them or not. But that's another example of a very recent example of reverse innovation. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of innovation happening in the future in the developing countries, which will then have value for the developed countries.
So if I'm a multinational from India or from China or from Brazil, how do I use reverse innovation to compete effectively?
Well, let's step back for a minute and think about what kinds of innovations actually will come out of the developing countries. Because they're not going to be the same kinds of innovations that come out of the developed countries. Very often the innovations in the developed countries involve breakthrough technologies. That's not often the case with the developing countries because they're backward on technology. What they do are really innovate to create affordability. And by affordability, I mean not just 10 or 20% cheaper, but 70 or 80% cheaper. So it's ultra affordability because that's what the local population in the emerging markets can afford. A second feature to a lot of the innovations is simplicity. How do you make the products simple? How do you make them portable? How do you make them easy to operate and maintain? How do you make it usable by people who are not very highly skilled and so on? And a third feature is making the products rugged so that in the harsh environment of the developing countries, where you have unreliable power and unreliable infrastructure. Your product has to be reliable in that very unreliable context. Now, if you create products with these features of being ultra affordable, simple to use, and very rugged in these harsh environments, you've created a product that almost any other emerging economy would also want. Now you can ask, why would such a product appeal to the developed countries? And the reason is that we have, as I said, poor people in rich countries, and an expanding segment in the developed countries who are looking for value because they cannot. They're feeling the squeeze of the income inequality. You have an aging population, many of whom are retired, can't afford to spend the way they could when they were younger. And then you have also a large segment of the population that is not able to keep up with the income of the people at the top. So the expanding value segment in the developed countries, these kinds of products can actually be perfect for them. Now let me give you an example of this idea, which might be, I think, easier way to grasp it. If you think of the copier when it first came out, do you remember those clunky machines, noisy and expensive to use, failing all the time, and they'd have to bring a technician over to fix it every time? Then it evolved to something called a personal copier, which I still have. You have probably at home, sits on your desk. You hardly ever have to maintain it. It's very easy to use. It's affordable, it's simple, easy to use, and it's quite rugged. So these are the features that, as a product moves from being a new product with sophisticated users and high prices to a product for personal use at home. This journey, actually, if you go through the emerging markets, that's what reverse innovation does for you. It takes existing products and compresses the time in which this evolution happens. We used to call it the experience curve effect. That experience curve effect is getting accelerated by this journey through the emerging economies. So the emerging economies can become a place where you develop such products and then you can bring them back and open up new segments and opportunities in the developed countries.
Now, innovation by itself is rarely sufficient. We need a whole strategy around innovation, such as branding, pricing, distribution channels, etc. So how do these local firms in emerging markets successfully trickle up, if you will, their reverse innovations into a US or a European market?
That's a great question. It leads into another question, and that is, what is the role of the local emerging market firms versus the multinational firms, which also operate in the emerging markets? And what can each one of them do to diffuse these kinds of innovations out of the developing countries? The advantage of the local firms is that they're usually first to develop these kinds of products because they understand the local consumers very well. They've been in intimate knowledge of them. They already have distribution systems in place in their home markets, and they have relationships with their customers. So they are looking for the right kinds of products. And often they're the first ones to develop these ultra-affordable, simple-to-use, rugged products for the home market. Their weakness is exactly what you raised, which is when you want to take these products abroad, they don't have a multinational network yet in place. They have to create that. And it's a slow process, it's a cumbersome process, and it's a risky process. Multinational companies, on the other hand, already have a global network. They are ready to take an innovation, move it from one place to everywhere else. But they are not as good in the first step of the process, which is developing products that are ultra affordable, simple to use, and rugged. So you have this interesting dynamic in the competition between the local players and the foreign players. Can the local players learn how to internationalize their business faster than the multinationals can learn how to develop the appropriate products for the emerging markets? Sometimes a multinational firm wins, sometimes a local firm wins. So if you want an example of a local firm that's won, I'd say take something like Huawei. It started out basically by making telecom equipment ultra affordable and cater to the Chinese market. And they used those advantages to sell into other emerging markets. They also offered some other goodies like customizing to the needs of the local customer very quickly because they had abundant supply of inexpensive engineers back home, and so on. But then over a period of time, they caught up with the technology, and they were not just competing on cost. In 3G and 4G, they were competing mainly on cost. But on 5G, they actually got to the frontier, and they are now actually in some ways ahead of the Western companies in 5G. And they have, over a period of time, succeeded in creating this international network of distribution and brand building and so on. Of course, they're having some issues now, and we can probably talk about this with the tensions between the U.S. and China and what that means for the whole reverse innovation story.
Right. But when you think of strategy, resources are critical for competitive advantage. And what you seem to be saying is local firms have a competitive advantage because they understand the local market and can leverage things like ruggedness and affordability to create products that are ideal for the local market and then can be diffused abroad. So if you take this concept of build, borrow, or buy, should not multinationals start either licensing those reverse innovations to bring home or form some sort of partnership with these local firms?
Well, sometimes they do that. You have a local company as your partner for the low-end products.
Right.
Right. Sometimes you want to completely offshore it and outsource it at the same time. The problem with that approach for the multinational firms is the following. If you decide I can't compete in the value segment because I'm good at the premium segment, so I'll stay in the premium segment, I'll give them the value segment. The problem is that they're not going to be happy staying in the value segment. They have every motivation to want to migrate up to the premium segment. You have difficulty migrating down to the value segment, but they have motivation, incentive, financial rewards to migrate up to the premium segment. So then, if you think of how this will play out in the long run, how long before they decide to eat your lunch, first in the home market at the premium segment, and then take those products, which they can actually offer you premium products at low prices. This idea that premium products have to be high prices is not something that they subscribe to. So they will come and disrupt you in your traditional home markets or the developed country markets. That's why GE actually invented this idea that we will disrupt ourselves. Because if we don't disrupt ourselves, somebody else is going to do it for us. Probably a Chinese competitor or an Indian competitor will eventually disrupt us. So we can't afford to let that happen. We won't just lose the market in the emerging economies. We might even lose our traditional markets in the developed countries. Now add to this the added complication that a lot of the world's growth today is in the emerging markets. At one time you could say, that's kind of a afterthought. The real opportunity is in the developed countries. But today, actually, the growth is in the emerging markets. 2/3 of the world's growth is happening in the emerging markets. Not in every product category, but overall in aggregate in terms of GDP growth. So to say, let's leave the value segment to these players means leaving also a very big chunk of the growth opportunity to the local players.
I get it, yeah. Now, you've written most recently about reverse innovation in healthcare, which is more of a personal services kind of business. So I'm curious, how does reverse innovation work in an industry which relies on interaction between people, between the provider and the consumer?
That's a great question. Of the examples I started with, Grameen Bank and TikTok, both are services. Of course, one is a digital service. Banking also now has been digitized. So you could actually rephrase your question and say, what about non-digital services?
Okay.
I think if you take non-digital or even services which have not yet been digitalized, there I think the emerging market firms will have a harder time. But when I think of many of these, what we used to think of as service industries, they have become digitalized. Education is getting digitalized. Banking is getting digitalized. A lot of financial services, insurance, wealth management, investing, borrowing, all of that is getting digitalized. So there are very significant parts of the service industry which are getting digitalized. In some non-digitalized services as well, there are very formidable competitors in countries like China. Take construction. Where have we had the construction boom of the last 20 years? China alone has consumed half the world's cement and steel in this period because they have gone on a construction boom that looked like it would never end. And now it's gone so far, they're actually having some problems of having invested too much in construction. But that construction opportunity has created Chinese companies with real, again, unique capabilities in doing things at low cost, doing things very quickly. There's one company called Broad Construction that they built a 50-storied, multi-storied building in 15 days with a lot of modularized construction or something. I may have the facts a little bit off, but this is again a kind of innovation that comes out of operating in that market. Some of that can be transferred, I think, and certainly China has transferred a lot of that through its Belt and Road initiative. Right? They're able to do projects in Ethiopia, in Ghana, in Zambia, and South America, and so on, using some of the techniques that they mastered in the Chinese home market. So between the services that can be digitalized, some of the services that maybe can't be, but where these countries have built real significant capabilities, there is a very, very significant part of the global economy that is open to this kind of competition. What I say to companies and managers when I talk to them is start with the assumption that every industry can be disrupted by this kind of a reverse innovation. Maybe there's an exception. Don't start with the assumption that it is the exception where this can happen. Start with the assumption that it could happen everywhere. I think GE's CEO was quite perceptive when he recognized the danger that these emerging market firms could pose to his survival. In fact, he said, we know how to compete with Philips and Siemens and companies like that. We're used to competing with them. It's these new companies from the emerging markets that could eat our lunch. And they actually did eat GE's lunch.
Very good. Now, you mentioned earlier about the tensions between China and the U.S. and this spilling over into the global trade and investment market. So is reverse innovation going to be reduced because of these tensions? Or what is your perspective on the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a question where I think the jury is still out. First thing I would say is China is probably the single most important source of reverse innovations because it's had the most dynamic growth, right? Blistering rates of growth until recently. It has very competent manufacturing capabilities. The Chinese, overseas Chinese, have been exemplary in terms of their manufacturing prowess. They've displayed that all across Asia before even the rise of China. And just a lot of that capability has then been transferred over into China. And so China has built enormous capabilities for this kind of innovation. So if China is not allowed to participate in this reverse innovation process, some of those innovations will either get trapped in China, or they will go to only other emerging markets, or they will go to a few developed countries which say, we don't care if it's from China. And so it may work for any product that doesn't have any hint of national security implications. Today, the trade war has become a tech war between the US and China. And so there are many product areas in which this kind of reverse innovation potential exists in technology-intensive businesses. It's not only at the low end that they can play this game. They're playing the same kind of a game, using scale to run down costs, using process innovations to run down costs, using the ecosystem advantage that they have everything they need to make a product within a few hours or a few miles of where they're operating. So they can do prototyping much, much faster than we can in the US. And they can do it in hours or days as opposed to weeks. So speed as a competitive advantage. All of these advantages China has and is applying across a range of industries. They're also investing heavily in R&D and capabilities to catch up. So it's no longer a story of simply reinventing old products to dumb them down or make them ultra affordable. They want to come up with the next generation of products. So if the US and China get into this kind of a situation, we're going to find the two most dynamic, innovative economies not being able to profit from each other's innovations. Chinese companies will get shut out of the US. US companies will get shut out of China. They already are in many important industries. China has actually been doing that for a long time through its industrial policy. The US is waking up to it and now starting to prohibit Chinese companies from coming into the US. So you could have a bifurcation of the two biggest markets and the two most dynamic economies not being able to freely move ideas back and forth. So I think that will be a loss for consumers. It will be a loss for the innovation process.
So it might be a reduction in efficiency and productivity,
Yes.
possibly higher inflation because you don't have the reduction in prices. Now, you also wear the hat as the head of the Center for Emerging Markets, which you founded, I think, in 2007. Can you tell us about that initiative, the importance of, first of all, why you're so passionate about the Center for Emerging Markets?
Well, like you, I came from India to the U.S., and when I arrived here, I discovered that business schools in the U.S., including Northeastern, but even other schools, were not recognizing the importance of countries like India. At the time, China had not opened up, the Soviet Union had not opened up, but even then there were enough countries like Brazil and India and South Korea and all of Africa, which were actually somewhat open, not as open as they are today. And I felt the needs of those countries and the opportunities presented by those countries were really being overlooked by business schools. And so for my entire professional career, I kept working on those countries. About 15 years back, it was so apparent that these countries were no longer just of interest to fringe players or fringe academics like me, but it was going to be important to all companies and all academics. And it really needed to be brought center stage into the conversation and life of universities like Northeastern. And so that's why I argued with the university, let's plant the flag, let's build the capabilities. And over time, I think we've created a lot of awareness. We have 60 faculty members from across the university who are now affiliated fellows of the center. We have things we're doing for students, things we're doing for companies. We have a very distinguished advisory board of corporate executives helping and guiding the Center for Emerging Markets. So I think we've made some progress. And I think we are at the second inning of the story of the emerging markets. I think this is a long-term story. Like the Industrial Revolution was a long-term, multi-decade story, seeing the rise of the industrialized countries. We are now in the early stages of the rise of the emerging economies, catching up with the developed countries. There will be bumps in the road. The great decade of 2000 to 2010, where emerging economies were firing on all cylinders, and you couldn't find an emerging economy that wasn't growing at 5%. That was the anomaly. That was the unusual period. We're now back to more typical behavior of the emerging economies. Some do well, some not so well. But over a long period of time, these countries are going to grow twice as fast as the developed countries. Almost the entire increase in the world's population over the next decades is going to be in the emerging economies.
So Ravi, you've been talking a lot about the changing balance of power because of innovation. Do you want to reflect back on how this balance of power originally funded, if you will, enabled colonization and the growing richness of the West, and how perhaps that balance is shifting because of reverse innovation?
Well, The Economist some years back had a very interesting chart showing the GDP of all of the countries of the world divided between those that are emerging and what we would today call emerging and those that are developed or industrialized. If you go before the Industrial Revolution, the GDPs of each category of countries is almost proportional to its population. So the industrialized countries had 25% of the world's population and 25% of the world's GDP. And the developing or emerging economies had 75% of the world's population and 75% of the world's GDP. Then the Industrial Revolution happens. And overnight, not overnight, but in a matter of decades, you find the incomes of the industrialized countries starts to rise at a much faster rate than that of the developing countries. Then, of course, the process of colonization also adds to that, facilitated by the industrialization. That lasts through several decades and is only beginning to reverse itself now since these countries, the emerging economies, embraced globalization and opened up to the global market. And that has allowed innovations to go from the developed countries to the developing countries and speed up their rates of growth and lay the foundations for those countries, the emerging economies, to then also become contributors of innovations for the rest of the world.
Ravi, we've been talking about reverse innovation, and I know that some of your most recent work involves reverse innovation in healthcare. Now, healthcare is complex because it involves quality of life. It's not just about profits. And secondly, it involves direct personal interaction between providers, nurses, doctors, the pharmacists, etc., and the patient. So, how is reverse innovation happening in healthcare? And what are some interesting lessons from that segment of the industry for the phenomenon of reverse innovation?
Yeah, thank you for asking about our work in healthcare, which we actually did in India. It started out with recognition that we have a real problem in the developed countries, that healthcare costs are out of control and quality is uneven despite all of that spending, and access is not 100%. So how do we solve the problem in countries like the US? Our initial insight was you're not going to find good answers or good ideas for solving the problem of high costs in the US if you only look at other developed countries, because they're all stuck with the same problem. They all have insurance payments, payers covering the costs, third parties covering the costs. Nobody quite cares about cost in that whole system. You go to the developing countries and you find people are uninsured and they're paying out of pocket for a lot of their health care. They really are looking for value. If you want value-seeking customers, you have to go to countries like India. And the hospitals that are innovative in that context have figured out how to provide good quality care at very low prices. And one of the points I should mention in this context, anyone who knows India will say, oh my God, are you telling me India has the best healthcare? No. We're not saying India's system as a whole is the best. Individual hospitals in India have been remarkably innovative in finding ways to provide high quality care at very, very low cost. And the analogy I would make is to what happened in manufacturing with Ford and Toyota. Ford invented the assembly line and showed that you could lower cost by 83% and improve quality, because cars made in the assembly line were actually more dependable in quality than cars made one by craftsmen. Ford and Toyota showed us is that you can get higher quality and lower cost at the same time. That if you use TQM, you can produce cars with no defects almost 99 or 100% of the time if you follow that process. At the same time, you lower cost because there's no rework, there's no wasted effort, there's no lost components and damaged goods and so on. So you can have higher quality and lower cost. Ford and Toyota taught us this in manufacturing. These Indian hospitals like Arvind Eye Care can show teaching us exactly the same point about healthcare services, that you can provide really world-class eye care, for instance, for 1% of the price at which it is administered in the developed
1% of the price.
Arvind Eye Care can give you a cataract surgery for 1% of the cost with the same levels of outcomes as the National Health Service in the UK.
Impressive.
So that was the main takeaway of the healthcare. Now, the reversing of that innovation and diffusing it to the developed countries is a very different story with a service like healthcare. To go to your earlier point about can services be, can you use reverse innovation with services? It is harder. So in this example, our advice to healthcare organizations and insurers in the US is go to India, watch, learn. It's for free. It's the cheapest way of R&D that you can ever do. Some of it you will find you can use. Not all of it, but some of it you will find you can use. And the more progressive US hospitals like Ascension actually have struck a joint venture with one of these innovative Indian hospitals. And they created a joint venture in the Cayman Islands to cater to the US population, where they can take some of the Indian practices, but bring it very close to the US. Very close so that they can actually serve US patients, but not in the US, because if you're in the US, you're stuck with all of the constraints of the US system. So that is an interesting variant of the diffusion process. But you're right, it's much harder with many services like healthcare.
But again, the promise is high, that learning from countries like India, South Korea, Thailand, as well as China in the areas of healthcare allows you to do process innovations.
Correct.
And also perhaps completely new ways of doing certain medical, surgical practices, which together can give you high outcomes at low quality.
Exactly.
Excellent, Ravi. This has been a very eye-opening session.
Thank you. And anyone who's interested can look at our book, or we have a couple of HBR articles based on that research.
What are can you recall the name of the article, the title of the book?
Yeah, book is called Reverse Innovation in Healthcare,
Okay.
how to make value-based delivery work. And the article we first published was called Delivering World-Class Healthcare Affordably in HBR, which was based on the work we did in India. And the second article is called Transforming Healthcare from the Ground Up. And there is really trying to take the lessons from India and give concrete examples of U.S. healthcare organizations that are already using those approaches to get similar kinds of results. In other words, explaining that it is in fact possible to borrow some ideas from places like India and use them in places like the US. Now, one example is telehealth. The countries like India were much farther along with telehealth because they had to be. They didn't have enough doctors, and patients were often very far away from the doctors. And today in the US, we recognize after COVID that, hey, maybe telehealth is not such a bad idea. So that's one example.
Now, when you think of emerging markets, it's not just about raising incomes. It's also about public health, about education, about infrastructure, in general, about making people better off, better standard of living. So in what ways are Western multinationals going to be influenced if they decide to become more deeply involved in either manufacturing or selling or even reverse innovation from emerging markets?
Well, that's a challenge I think many companies are going through because the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting from the north to the south, from the west to the east. And it's going to happen over a long period of time. But companies headquartered in the West, in the US or in Europe, the power is still very much concentrated in these markets, but the opportunities are increasingly elsewhere. So they are reinventing themselves. This evening we have the CEO of Honeywell will be giving a talk at the center. He's an Indian American executive who started his career working for Honeywell in India. Over a matter of 3 decades, he has risen from being an employee in India to the CEO of the company. Now that is an indication of how multinationals are prepared to reinvent themselves. This is happening partly because they've been able to draw on the talent from these countries and bring them from the periphery to the center. But also I think they're recognizing that the company's mindset and culture has to change. So there is a slow process of reinventing that'll have to happen. They are moving some influence and power into the emerging regions. But it's a struggle because, there's big companies, bureaucracies are hard to change. It won't happen on a dime.
Now, you just mentioned an activity, a speech, a talk that the CEO of Honeywell will be giving this evening. I presume this is not unique. You have several such events every year. So my question to you is, if our audience wants to be able to take more advantage of the activities and learn from the Center for Emerging Markets, what can they do?
They should go to the Center for Emerging Markets. Just if they Google, they can find the site. You just have to sign up. It's a very simple process. You'll hear about all our events. We also have a playlist on YouTube with many of our past events. Not all of them are recorded. We have about 80 or 90 such events that we've recorded and posted, which has a lot of very, very valuable educational content that faculty may be able to use in their classes. We also have a very ambitious research program. They can learn about all of that by visiting this site.
And I assume some of our executives who are in the audience could also benefit from listening to some of these YouTube videos and podcasts to be able to apply to their own managerial processes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We very much want to connect with the world of managers and policymakers. We did an India summit a few months back, for instance. We had the ambassador of India's ambassador to the U.S. inaugurate the summit. We had CEOs, founders, we had ministers, policymakers. So we very much want to connect in the spirit of Northeastern, connect with the world of practice, have an impact on the world of practice. So yes, we love to hear from more and engage more extensively the audience of this kind of podcast.
So as we conclude, what would be the 2 or 3 things you'd like our audience to retain about emerging markets and reverse innovation?
We are going through a profound shift in the nature of the global economy. The center of gravity is shifting from the developed countries to the developing countries. This is a long-term process, and we have to recognize the implications of this for how companies are managed, how careers are planned, what people want, kinds of skills people need to gain, the capabilities. You've talked in this series that individuals and managers need to acquire to operate in that kind of world. So I think that's one very important takeaway. I think a dose of humility and openness to ideas from all parts of the world is going to be important. There is a risk of thinking that if it's not invented here, it's no good, or that everything important is invented only in the developed countries. The developed countries are still going to be important engines of innovation, but a lot of very good and useful innovations are going to come from strange places. E-payments, mobile payments was pioneered in Kenya. Who would have thought, right? There are many other innovations happening in other emerging economies. And we can all be better off if we are open to borrowing and sharing and learning from other countries as well as the countries in which we happen to live.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ravi. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the importance of emerging markets now and in the future, and this very unique phenomenon of reverse innovation from emerging markets.